Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, we did an episode not too long ago about choking, which is really sexual strangulation. It was based upon an op ed that was in the New York Times, written by Peggy Ornstein, author of Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex. And we got a lot of outreach as a result. We got DMs and emails, and I got calls from friends, and people just didn't know about some of the trends in sexual behaviors among young people. And they had lots and lots and lots of questions. And so we were lucky enough to be connected with Debby Herbenick, who is the lead researcher behind so much of the data that Peggy relies upon as she then embarks on connecting with and being in conversation with kids on these college campuses. And Debby is, I mean, as vast as her knowledge is on this topic, and she's been doing this for a long time, and I'll let you describe her path. But as vast as that knowledge is, she's that cool and relatable. She's easy to talk to. She's warm. She loves what she does. So this episode turned out to be so much more than what I expected, for sure, because here's this person who's on the front lines of the research, who literally uses the phrase, I love these kids. I've never met these kids before, and I love them and I care about them. And it all comes through.
Yeah, I mean, Debbie's work researching trends in sexuality and sexual behavior in people of all ages, but she's a college professor and does a lot of research into the sexuality and behavior of young people, teens, and mostly college students. And she's, an internationally recognized sexuality researcher and a certified sexuality education. She's a professor at Indiana University School of Public Health. She's written 5 best-selling books about human sexuality, including her most recent book, which came out just before ours, Yes, Your Kid, which is a great title. But what I find to be, and I hope listeners feel this way, the takeaway from this episode is the ways in which Debby approaches really complex topics with compassion, without shame, without judgment, and really in seeing young people in the best possible light she can. And looking at what she hopes for in the underlying progress for these kids and their lives and their relationships. And it's a really meaningful episode and conversation. And our goal is that for all of you who read that op-ed and who are thinking a lot about this topic, feel more knowledgeable and more empowered after listening to Debby. Hi, Debby. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Delighted.
So when we were preparing for this episode, your research...
preparing for life, Debby, for this episode.
The groundwork started 47 years ago. No, but seriously, I mean, we've been following your work, and then most recently, your work was heavily cited in an op-ed by Peggy Ornstein in the New York Times about trends in rough sex amongst teens and young adults. In particular, her piece focused on the trend in choking. But we want to broaden the conversation, and listeners, we will get there. Don't worry. We will get there to the thing that is keeping you up at night in deep sweats and, grinding teeth. But we want to pull the lens back a little bit, and really, Cara really wishes this whole episode could be about this, and to understand, Debby, how you got into the work as a sexuality researcher and educator to begin with, because I think that will frame for listeners the goals and the intentions of this field of work in the first place to ground us in the larger conversation.
Sure. I think when I look back that I probably got into sex research and sex education because I didn't have much sex education myself. I didn't get a puberty talk at home. I got the video at school that, most kids get, and amazingly, they still show today. And so I was really, really not well informed about bodies and puberty and sexuality. And what I really originally wanted to do was to work with kids. I wanted to go and study like child development and be a psychologist who worked with kids. And I was completely on that track in college and graduated college. But when I graduated, I graduated a bit early, a semester early. And so I had to take a little time before I went on to grad school. And I took a job, and there was a job that was about child sexual development. Of course, I was interested for the kid perspective. The study involved adults, like recalling their childhood and adolescence. And so I got the job because of my qualifications with like kid related things and statistics and all of that. But once I got there, I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know any of the sexuality part. And there's all these people around me doing sex research and education, and I don't know anything. But there's actually ways to learn all of that. And these people are studying that. So I think I just realized that my curiosity was much more focused now on the fact-based sexuality education and how I could like create more science in this area, and that I could probably spend my whole life being curious and finding ways to like address that curiosity with research. So that's how I got into it.
And let's just tie that back to kids for a second, because, anyone who listens to this podcast on a regular basis knows that it's our belief that teaching kids about their bodies, about sexuality, all of those things keeps them healthier and safer. But this is your expertise at a depth and level that is far beyond ours. So can you expand on that belief and philosophy about the importance of educating kids in this way?
I think sex education has always been really important. Puberty education, body education, right? Starting at the earliest ages with like giving kids, words for their bodies. And it's critical for all the reasons. It's critical because when they're little, we want them to be able to talk with us and with their doctors and nurses about what's bothering them, if anything's bothering them. We want to give them words that if anyone were to touch them in ways they shouldn't be touched, that they have words to talk about that. And then I think, even with puberty, like puberty's coming, whether we like it or not. And, as we all know, one of the things that's really hard for kids about it is that there's no way to control the timing of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so being prepared early is so important, right? We often say like, talk years in advance. Just normalize the conversation. So at all these different ages and stages, it's protective. And of course, as kids get older, it's protective in terms of preventing pregnancy, when you're too young to be pregnant, don't want to be pregnant, keeping yourself safer, being able to have conversations with, people you're hanging out with or dating about your readiness or lack of readiness. It always happens. And these days, with so much shifting around technology and rising STI rates and changing sexual behaviors, I think sex education is more important than ever.
Vanessa keeps teasing that I wish the whole episode was about your path to get here. But the reason why I'm so fascinated with it is that it strikes me that you do what you do in large part for the same reason that I do what I do, which is many of us come at our work because we didn't have access to something. We then want to learn what we didn't learn. And then a whole world is opened up to us that is so different than the world we grew up in. That is so like the features of pediatric medicine, that most of it was not resonant at all to me. I didn't grow up with many of the diseases that I treated. Your life experience, my guess is, it was not similar to so many of the kids that you have studied and spoken with over the years. And yet it's that crack in the doorway that sort of pushes you to open it and go through it, which is your life experience. And Vanessa comes at this from the other side of the door, which is tons of conversation and lots of openness. And it's just a good reminder that no matter where your origin story began, everyone can get there, right? Everyone can get there. And that is really why I love hearing about different people's paths. And you don't have to live it to be expert at it, and you don't have to have been completely naive to it. Okay, that was my soliloquy. I'm done with that. So let's now get into some nitty gritty. And we're going to do this not from a fear mongering position, because that's not helpful to anyone. So, listeners, take a deep exhale. You don't need to worry about the information that's coming, but just sit back and relax and absorb the information that's coming. So, I want to start with your role leading the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior. Can you explain what that is, who you survey, how you survey, and why those results are believable, valid, why we should pay attention to them in the first place?
Sure. So the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior has been ongoing since 2009. We've collected 8 waves of data collection since then. And so there are these very, very large nationally representative surveys of Americans, usually in most waves as young as 14. And then when we go up through the lifespan, which we usually do, our oldest participants are either in their mid 90s or early 100s. So I think our oldest participant so far has been 104.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and but they're often somewhere around 95, 97, something like that. But sometimes we've got a couple of early hundreds in there, and it's this probability based sample, which basically means that everybody has a chance to be in it. And so you can't volunteer into it. So it's not like a biased study in the sense of, if I were to just survey people just in the town where I live here in Bloomington, Indiana, it's going to be a very specific slice of Americans. But this is Americans all over, again, from 14 to usually mid 90s. And so it's essentially this random sample of people. And there are thousands. Our most recent one, we had about 9,600 Americans in it. And so it's as good as it gets in terms of survey methods. There's always going to be some biases to every study. I mean, there's some people who might say, no, I'm not going to take a study like that. But we also have ways of checking our data against surveys like ours in other countries, as well as surveys in ours in the US that collect somewhat similar data. So for example, we can compare our data on contraceptive usage with US studies on that to make sure that we line up well enough in certain areas to say these data seem reliable to us. And they do. Yeah, we've been conducting the NSSHB surveys since 2009 to track sexual attitudes and behaviors in the United States.
So one of the things we think a lot about is how questions are asked and what questions are asked. So for instance, we spent a lot of time, as I'm sure you do, with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Listeners, we did an episode on the most recent survey, which came out last year and was a survey conducted in 2021. And one of the topics of note, and Debbie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And this is what lots of folks who work with teens and young adults keep talking about, which is rates of sex amongst teenagers are down. And yet the way they asked about sex was actually quite general. And then if we dig in and we look at other research, rates of vaginal intercourse are down, but rates of oral and anal sex are up. And I'm curious, kind of how that correlates to what you're seeing, right? The results, but also how you would wish other researchers asked or framed their questions to young people about sex.
Sure. Yeah, it's tricky. So we actually did publish a study a few years ago that compared NSSHB data, so our national survey data from 2009 to 2018. And we actually thought that rates of oral sex and anal sex might be up, but they weren't. They were down. And so they were down with everything else for each individual behavior that we assessed. And really surprisingly to us, so was masturbation. And so for adults, every behavior had decreased from 2009 to 2018, but masturbation had not. And for teens, all of it had. So we do have more recently collected data from 2022, from the end of 2022. So we'll be comparing that soon. So I can't tell you yet what those patterns look like. But, the strength of our survey is that different from YRBS and every other kind of large, what we call a surveillance study, what we do differently, really even distinctly around the world, is we look at every single individual behavior, not like every behavior that you could imagine, but of the behaviors that we ask, like receiving oral sex, performing oral sex, putting your penis in somebody's anus, performing anal sex, receiving anal sex. So we get pretty specific Because as you've noted, the challenge of many of these other surveys is that they just say like, how old were you when you first had sexual intercourse? And that can mean different things to different people. And so, I think YRBS also, like so many federal surveys, has the challenge of not being federally mandated in all states. I wish it were. And so states can opt out, as we're seeing, they can opt out of the survey entirely, or they can opt out of sections of it. And so I get that the researchers who are in charge of it really have to walk a line, right? What's going to be acceptable to the most number of states? And probably if they ask the kinds of questions that we asked and some others ask, it would be, politically, some people might just say, no, we're not going to ask those questions, which is such a shame because, it doesn't mean the people in the state aren't doing the things. And years ago, I, spoke with somebody who was very high up in government, and their work was focused on like adolescent pregnancy. But they were looking at all these states, right, that had like very, very high rates of unintended pregnancy with teenagers. And yet they were not able to ask the questions. Like those states were refusing to ask the sexual behavior questions. So they were so limited, right? And how they help those states figure out their challenges.
Is there a layer to this also, that if you are asking a 14, 16, 18-year-old about their sexual behavior, or frankly with YRBS about their mental health, about their drug and alcohol use, but for you in particular, they're responding to a complete stranger. They're reporting behavior that is, for many of them, relatively undiscussed or shamed, or, a third rail topic in their home. Why are they going to answer a total stranger and tell them what they're really doing?
We do different kinds of studies. Some are interviews and some are surveys. So one thing is we're really good at what we do, right? Most people who have their jobs, right, like they spend a lot of time getting trained in their jobs. And so the type of training that we have is really how to build a survey that people will respond to and will respond to, most of them, honestly, right? There are going to be some people who either say, no, I've never had sex, when they really have. And there might be some people who inflate their numbers of partners, but, it should even out, right? You should sort of even out if you have people on both sides of the things, maybe being a little bit dishonest, but you want most people to be being, honest as they can. So part of it's building a survey. And, I was giving feedback on a student survey recently who, like their fourth or fifth question in was something really sensitive. I was like, no, like we go gently in, right? We go gently in, we build rapport, we build trust. We, when we get to sensitive items, we sometimes couch them and describe again why we're doing that. If we ask something that seems sensitive, we also provide resources when we get into potentially distressing questions. We provide some websites or crisis numbers if we're potentially going to ask tricky things. When we do the interviews, and we get actually some of the same feedback in surveys, but I was just doing an interview yesterday and got a note from the person we interviewed afterwards who just said, thank you so much, right, for creating this shame-free, non-judgmental space where I felt affirmed in my life. And that's the experience we have so often, is that people feel like this is just a safe space where I can talk. And when I've worked with teenagers interviewing them in family planning clinics, they often just felt like they knew we couldn't tell their parents what they were saying. There's rules around doing research, and they knew that. But they also said, like, thanks for letting me just like say this. I just wanted to like talk to an adult about this, but I can't at home.
So they so incredible.
Tell us, but they could ask us questions too.
It's simply remarkable. I've literally never in my life thought about the fact that survey, whether it's with a person or frankly, probably on paper or on computer as well, can be therapeutic for the respondent. That's remarkable.
Debby, one question about the ages of the kids. For teens who are under 18, how does it work to have permission to collect data and responses from them?
Yeah, so for the NSSHB, they do have to have parental consent.
Okay.
And that's a limitation. It is a limitation that we might have some, we might be missing out on some kids whose parents would say, no way. We do try to explain very carefully, to the parents, who we are, the kind of work we do, why we're doing what we do, and what kinds of questions. And we actually give those parents resources too. So
Mm.
we do have very high rates of parents agreeing to let their kids in. But it is possible that we're missing out, right, on some section of kids who wouldn't be allowed in otherwise. But we do actually seek parental consent first, because technically the federal guidelines are that minors can't consent for themselves to be in research,
Right.
which does have some limitations. But there are some, so states also vary, like with parents, either like sort of opting in or opting their kids out of different studies.
Okay. So I hope everyone has like a real grounding in the way you do your work. We're going to start with the positives. We're going to start with, what are some positive trends that you are seeing amongst teens and young people in their sexuality? Because I don't want people to feel like this is all gloom and doom. I think there's been tons of wonderful progress, and I'd love to speak to that before we get into some of the other complex topics.
I mean, I would say that I just love being around teenagers and young adults. I'm a college professor, so I really love teaching college students and hearing about their lives. I prize their openness. I think especially around issues of gender and sexual orientation, like recent generations, maybe the past, I would say 8 to 10 years that I've been teaching, you just see such radically different openness than I did, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And so there's so much acceptance of one another and awareness of diversity, which I think is really, really neat among the younger generation. I think there is a longing for intimacy that's not always met. And I mean like
Mm.
connection, intimacy, but
Mhm.
I think we're seeing some really interesting shifts and important shifts with young people noticing when they don't have that and trying to figure out ways to get that. Again, for many people, it's a positive that we are seeing less partnered sex among teenagers. It's complicated, though, that we're not seeing the corresponding decrease in STIs, and that really, is challenging. I mean, I know for a lot of my colleagues in the federal government, like, gosh, we know teens are having less sex, but why are the STI rates what they are? Why did they keep going up? Like they keep
Can I
going
ask?
up.
Can I ask
Mhm.
a quick question specifically about that? Is it that screening detection is better? Is that a component of it, that a young person goes into a doctor's office or a university health clinic and it's extraordinarily easy today compared with even 5 or 10 years ago to give a urine sample or do a swab and pick up STIs? Or do you think that number is real in a different way?
I mean, it's been going up for so
Yeah,
long
yeah,
that
yeah.
think there is some realness to it. I have a theory that I'm not the person to test, but I do think that part of it is also that we use antibiotics like much more carefully than we used to. And so a lot of people don't get antibiotics. I feel like when I first started teaching, I had a lot of students who didn't really get tested that often, or maybe like or twice a year, but they would say like, like, I was sick recently and got a Z pack. So if I had chlamydia, it was probably cleared anyway. I mean, it was kind of interesting that some of them sort of relied on the fact that they would get like antibiotics a few times a year. Not that that cures like all the
Mm.
STIs, but it is true that some of them actually would have taken care of like a case of chlamydia. So I don't know.
Yes. Don't,
I think that's
listener, do
part of
not
it.
rely upon that treatment
No,
treatment
no.
path for your STI. Yeah.
I
Oh
mean,
my God.
I know we were going to say we're going positive, but since we've gone down the pathway of one of the less positive trends, which is the, consistent increase year over year of STIs, we do need to point to a couple of other trends that people would not deem to be positive. And we're going to paint the full picture here, folks, but we do need to talk about the decreased use of condoms, and what we call hookup culture, which probably will have a new name, next month or next year, but essentially people having, physical intimacy, partnered sex with multiple people, not necessarily in committed relationships, maybe multiple people in short periods of time, maybe not using condoms. I mean, can you speak to all those different factors as it relates to increased
Yeah,
STIs?
and I've done a lot of condom use research. So it was, we started noticing the decline around 2009. And it was really striking. I mean, it was a really big shift. And at first we thought, are the data not reliable? But then other data came out from other studies within the next year, and it became clear like that's just what was happening. And I think what concerns me the most about the decline in condom use isn't like the condom per se. It's what I saw in my classes, which is, again, I had been teaching human sexuality for college students since 2003. And around that period too, like 2009, 10, 11, I had so many more young women than ever before saying, how do I get my partner to use a condom? Or how do I like insist on using a condom? And so I think really what I feel really started to happening was less agency part of young women, especially I thought, gosh, like we all got information about this when we were in high school. We had a lot of talks about that. And so I think that's been a thread in a lot of changes in sexual behavior that concerns me, as young women feeling less able to stand up for themselves. We've had great medical, innovations, and so many of us love what the IUD and implant have brought, but they have also brought, a sense of like, well, we don't need to use condoms because they're on the IUD, they're on the implant, or I'm on the IUD implant. So I think we do still have that real challenge with many. Again, the value of sex education is that we can also share that, yes, these things are great for protecting against pregnancy. They are not protecting you against STIs. Like we, still need to use condoms if we're having sex.
And I mean, listen, when we're all of a similar age, and our sex education was about not getting AIDS. I mean, that was, we were beaten. Oh, sorry, this is like a terrible metaphor, but like we were beaten over the head with condom use. And the fear when we were young was not about getting pregnant, because it was like, okay, well, if it happens and I don't want to have the baby, I can get an abortion. But God, am I terrified of contracting HIV. And now it's like, it feels like it's the inverse, where nobody's seems particularly concerned amongst young people about HIV, but their, pregnancy and access to reproductive health is where the fear,
right, lies. Including among gay and bisexual males, which is really very, very interesting. And of course, tracks with the evolution of all the therapies, right? And HIV is now a virus that you can live with. But, my gay male friends who came of age at the same time that we all did are, of everyone I know, they're the most horrified by the data, right? Because this is really, it represents such a swing in the opposite direction.
It does. And we say, a lot of PrEP use, right? So people think that I'm using PrEP, so I don't need to be on on sort of like using condoms to protect against HIV. That's but now we see a lot of syphilis and other things. And so it's always, sexual behavior and the things that come along with it are always in flux. Yeah. And they're always changing, which requires, again, good research, but also good education and support of people in trying to figure out what they're going to do.
Debbie, before we get to some of the more concerning trends that you're noticing, I want to have a conversation about, as a society, conversations about consent and sort of, I believe, improving and burgeoning and widening conversations about consent. And I'm wondering, we do this work, we live in this bubble. Do you see the impact of a greater awareness around consent in kids of all ages and all topics? Do you see that result in the young people that you're interviewing and working with? Or are you not seeing that translate into the kind of their reality, their sexual reality?
I see some young people who have extraordinary ideas about consent. They get it. They have clearly been listening. Some of them have been active themselves as educators or activists and advocates. So there is a subset that I think, could rival most professionals in their understanding of consent. But I think for most young people, it's not there. I think for most young people, what I'm seeing is that they understand that consent is like there's lots of consent campaigns, and that they think consent is if somebody agreed to it, it's okay, and that's kind of it. And so I think we have heard some really, really been in really tough interviews where people had some really difficult things happen to them and did not think of them as assault. even though for those of us, whether it's, my faculty colleagues or the doctoral students working with us, we're like, wow, how did this person not understand that this was consent, that this was a non-consensual thing? Like what type of education never got to them, right?
Right.
We're talking about some pretty extreme things here. And so I think there are advances, but they're just not evenly getting to young people. And that is one of the jobs, right, of school-based sex education, is that it's supposed to like even the playing field, that even if your family didn't give that to you, or it didn't somehow, get to you, that it does because you're in school. And that's what we really lack when we don't have that.
And I hate to keep pivoting back to the technique of the interview, but I feel like this one screams for it. What do you do in a situation where someone is disclosing clearly there was an assault? They don't see it that way. Are you just the listener and the recorder of the information? Or is that the point at which you reintroduce, there are some resources, or do you get a little bit more proactive? Or and I ask really because I don't know what the job is when you come in.
Yeah. So for me, I care so deeply about everyone I interview. Like, I love these people, right? I haven't met them yet, and I love them. And so part of what we do on my team anyway, is that when we do interviews, we create sexual health resource sheets. We can anticipate that some portion of them will have had assault experiences or some kinds of difficult experiences. Maybe they just need information about STIs or something, but there could be something that may or may not come up in the interview, but we want to get it to them. So we create this resource sheet that everybody gets at the end of the interview. And so they all get it. And that way, by giving it to everyone, we're also not naming something as assault for somebody that they may not feel that way.
Totally.
Or they may not be ready to feel that way, but they have the resource if they want it. And it provides a number of things. We talk about, there are like sexual assault crisis types of resources on there, but we also provide resources to links about like yes, no, maybe sheets that might support communication. And so sort of sites that really talk in much more detailed ways about consent. So we try to give things to people. The process of the interview, though, is that yes, I'm there like largely as a listener, but I do try to sort of move people to some insight, ask questions in a way that might encourage them to just reflect on their experience, to ask themselves some questions, to think about it in new ways. And in that, we do see, it can be remarkable in just a 60 to 90-minute interview, how much somebody, obviously they're ready to talk. They've signed up for an interview voluntarily. So they're ready to talk and reflect. But even in that short period of time, you can get some people saying, yeah, I've never thought about this in this way. Or, and often it's because they've never talked with anyone, right? And I don't even think we're doing anything magical, but we've created a space where they could talk out loud for this period of time about their lives and their experiences. And if they've not done that with a good friend or a family member or a partner before, they might themselves come to this really interesting insight about their life, right? And it's not always really hard stuff. Sometimes they are able to recognize some incredible resilience within themselves, or they can see a pattern about how, yes, they had some really difficult experiences early on, but now look at the amazing choices that they've been making that are really healthy in their lives. So they can go in lots of different directions, but that's, to me, what that space is for.
So let's dig into some of the tougher topics. And we can look at the kind of category of rough sex. We can get into the research that Peggy cited in her op-ed about choking. And I have a funny, people are going to be surprised, but a funny comment from Peggy about the reaction to that piece. But before we do that, Debbie, I just think it's important that we ground this part of the conversation and the impact of pornography on kids and teens and young adults' understanding of sex. And I think I will let you just sort of generally share your perspective. Cara and I have shared in past episodes our perspective, but I'd love for people to hear just baseline your thoughts on that.
I think it's had a massive influence and continues to have a massive influence on young people. teenagers are having sex later than they used to in the US and in quite a few other countries, but they're also accessing pornography earlier than they used to. And the pornography that they're accessing is, is so much more voluminous than any earlier generation. And so they can see so many things. It is more aggressive than it used to be. And so they may be seeing pornography for, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years before they ever make out with somebody. So they're really, we have a phrase in research, we call it sexual scripts, right? That people sort of, they view these sexual scripts. And the most basic one for any listeners who are new to this idea is, that like there's this sense. I often go back to like, oh gosh, what was it? It's like so and so and so and so sitting in a tree, KISSING, right? But it's like first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage, right? Which is like we were being ingrained and like indoctrinated with that, right?
Totally. Yes.
But we have an idea that like, right, when people are having sex, they kiss, then they might do breast or chest touching, then they might do like, these like in the modern era, the sexual script is oral sex and then maybe some type of intercourse, right? But, it used to be like in the early 1900s, oral sex actually didn't come before intercourse. It was something people like either did very hardly ever, or only if they were usually like already married and having intercourse. And so it was like a later stage advanced behavior, which
That's so interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah,
That's
so
really
fascinating.
fascinating.
Time, right?
Okay.
They change in the culture all the time. And so so the thing is, right, they now get these sexual scripts that for a while we were calling like pornographic sexual scripts because they were just engaging in sex in different ways, and again like lots of like rougher kinds of ways, but also just the idea of like how you get consent or how you don't, or do you use a condom or not, right? Like condom use is shown in 2 to 3% of pornographic scenes of sex between women and men. It's higher for gay male porn, but it's really almost non-existent in most mainstream like heterosexual porn. So we know it's had a lot of influence. Sometimes some people get picky and say, you can't really prove it. There's been no randomly controlled, studies. Well, no one's going to take like children and randomly control them to like watch porn or not. So it's true. There's no randomly controlled trials. But to me, it's clear not only in the behavior patterns that we see, but young people tell us it themselves. Like
Yes.
I learned from watching, I learned this from watching porn. And they have lots of examples of it. So I believe them. So
let's now talk about rougher sex portrayed in porn and what trends you're seeing in your research.
Yeah, and so we can talk about that. I will say just as sexual scripts changed about the oral sex, right? Remember, every generation is horrified about other, like the younger generations, like sexual scripts. So some of this stuff is really concerning from a health perspective, but a lot of it is not. I'll say that too. And so
I think that's really important to say. I think it's like even my oldest to my youngest will look at his younger brother who's like, 7, 8 years younger and be like, I feel so bad for him, man. Like it, his generation. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? So everybody's busy judging everybody else's generation. And yes, like I get it. A lot of it is subjective and it's all, often about making yourself feel better about your world and your life and all of that. But so there are some things that are concerning and some things that are just different. Do you mind sort of bucketing for folks in your mind what those kinds of things, like what is concerning and what is just different?
Sure. So, so some things that have frankly been around for forever, like our older participants in our studies say, sure, I've engaged in light spanking, for example, right? But even hard spanking, even though that is really risen in prevalence in recent years, I mean, not to be dismissive, but like people aren't really going to die from hard spanking, right? So am I really worried about people, like the intensity with which people are spanking each other? Not really. Now I still want them to like talk about what they want and to like, have consent and all of that. But from a health perspective, that's not where my focus is. Hair pulling's been around for a while. Biting is something that became popular, like when Twilight was popular. We don't see as much of it, but like that's another sexual.
Wow.
I mean, people working in family planning clinics at the time were like, oh, we're always seeing these bite marks on people's bodies. And I don't hear about that as much anymore. So biting is still there, but it's not as much.
Although hickeys are back. You don't think so?
Are you not seeing that, Debbie? You're not seeing hickeys back?
Hickeys are there, but are they all from kissing? A lot of them
Tell
are
us more.
So some of them are fingerprints from choking.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, I mean, I just assumed what I was looking at was hickey based on shape and all that, but I could totally see that.
Yeah. So some of
Wow.
them are going to be a fingerprint. And so, yeah, see, I just
the needle just fell off the record.
Wow.
I'm
Mic
sorry,
drop.
we shouldn't laugh about that, but it was like you could literally hear it go like,
oh, the bruise. Yeah. So some of them are hickeys. I mean, for sure. Some of them are making out hickeys, but some of them are choking bruises.
Debbie, are there, forgive this phrase, I hate it with drugs and I've never used it with sex. Are there gateway behaviors that you see sort of one is predictive of a more aggressive one down the road?
Not that we know of yet. I mean, we may learn. I mean, I think that some of them have been around for many, many years, the spanking, some hair pulling. I think there can be progressions within a behavior. So what we do see is that, so maybe I'll back up because I started to talk about choking and not everyone is going to know what choking is.
Okay,
so
great.
Choking is a term that is, I mean, it's a behavior that's incredibly common right now among young people. They usually are referring to using one hand on the neck, sometimes both hands, less often like a forearm, like a chokehold, and you might see in like mixed martial arts, and less often a ligature, like a belt, a cord, or a tie to around the neck and then to squeeze. So it's usually one hand pressing, but again, can look differently too. And so because it's external pressure to the neck, and if it's done even like moderately, then it would restrict blood flow or airflow. Even at light pressures, I mean, you can. And so technically it makes it strangulation, even though everybody calls it choking. So when we ask people in interviews, like what words they use, they always say choking. If we ask them if they would consider themselves to engage in strangulation, they say, absolutely not. I think of that as something really violent. So that is the word that people will use. And that's actually true in domestic violence research. People will still say like, so-and-so choked me. They don't usually say they strangled me. People are
we got a comment actually on Instagram when we posted about Peggy's article when it first came out and about your research. And someone who works in a domestic violence clinic said, well, that's sexual strangulation. Like choking is choking on food. It's not like someone else. And I wrote back and I said, yes, technically that's the terminology, but the phrase that people are using is still choking. And also I didn't want to get taken down by Instagram. So I was worried about one phrase versus the other, if I'm being totally honest. So you're seeing, Debbie, that the term choking is used widely to refer to the sexual behavior. Okay.
Yeah. And in multiple countries, it's not just the US. So research is emerging from quite a few other countries now. And so it's whether it's in pornography and social media and TV shows, I mean, everyone just says choking. And so if we were to, educate people about sexual strangulation, like they don't connect with that. And they're going to say, I don't do that. So I do use the term that people use to describe, their behaviors in their lives. And so that's, what it is. And so we do find that about, so I should say, first of all, how common it is. We found that in college studies, and we've done 4 college campus representative surveys since before the pandemic, since early 2020 through very recently. And we always find that at least 2/3 of women, college women who have ever so much as like kissed somebody, which is like 90% of students. So they report having ever been choked at least once. And that number's crept up a little bit, so that by their senior year of college, that we see around 80% of college women report having been choked at least once during sex. So where I think that when I mentioned that, like there are some behaviors that I think people get more comfortable in and it progresses, is that we have heard from people that, they started with like light choking. We hear this very often, that they start kind of light. It might worry them. They might be scared about some of these risks. But then they get comfortable with it. They realize, I'm still alive. I feel okay. So some people do progress more, and they potentially, what worries me is potentially go more and more intense and get closer toward like loss of consciousness.
Can we look at that word comfort for 1 second? Is it that they get comfortable, or that they are sort of operating under the assumption that this is a sexual norm and it is something they need to give, they feel they need to give over to?
It depends on the person. So there are some people who clearly don't love it. There's really nothing much for them as the person being choked, or even the person choking. Some people are like, look, it's my hand. I don't get anything from this, right? So there are some people who are doing this who don't really like it, but they think their partner does. And so they just keep doing it.
And can you take that one step further and speak to this notion of whether strangulation enhances an orgasm, which I think is a very important piece to this puzzle?
So we thought that more people would say it does, because that's always been the sense for autoerotic asphyxiation. People like hang themselves and do other things alone. But we don't see too much of that. We do see some of it. I mean, I have absolutely interviewed people, and I think around 30% of our students say it enhances their orgasm or makes their orgasm easier. But mostly they say they engage in it because they think it's like kinky or exciting or adventurous, or their partner wants them to, or has asked them to do it to them. Or because they think it's just like what everybody does these days. Like what, and it's not even these days. I say these days, they think it's just what people do. Because actually, when we'll share with young people that, like when I was growing up, like almost nobody was doing this, right? Like this was not a thing you would hear about. It's not like, maybe except for like if there was a celebrity death from autoerotic asphyxiation or something, we didn't hear much about it. And they are floored by that because they're like, well, everybody kind of does it now. And it's not everybody, but it is very high numbers.
So I want to look at two trends. One is the people who are being asked to choke, the people reporting, right? So it's not only the question, and I love the way you do the research, because you don't just ask about having been the recipient of a certain sexual behavior, but you also talk about someone performing the sexual behavior, right? Both sides of it. And because this comes up a lot, and particularly we've heard from young men who are being asked to do it and are actually surprised or uncomfortable or any of the above. And the other thing that I'd like us to get into, Debbie, is the brain research around the impact of people who have been choked during sexual encounters. So if we could talk about the people who are being asked to choke someone else and then talk about the brain research, that would be great.
Yeah. So I think that we're not paying enough attention to the people asked to do the choking, which is usually young men. And so we include them in our research. We do all the same things, the interviews, the surveys, but I think the public conversation isn't there yet. And I think anybody who has sons, it's a great conversation with them to let them know like that they don't have to do this to people if they ask them to get them to start thinking about pressures that they might feel and how they might go, through that. Because I do think, just as I mentioned earlier, that I think young women have really, really experienced maybe like a sense of less agency over the last decade or so. I think young men have a lot of pressures on their sense of masculinity, and it's coming from several directions. And I think they don't always, know what to do. And there's been a lot of growth in that area, but we're still not where I wish we were. In my 20, I don't know, something years of teaching college sexuality, for example, I often say to people that I used to have these young men who would say, just a few every semester out of a class of 100 students that, they would tell me how like the importance of emotions and of dating someone that they really liked and having like, like a real partner and all of that. But they felt like they couldn't say that to anybody. And they would sometimes, but they wanted to express it so much. Sometimes they would say, you can even read this part of my paper out loud, just so girls know there's people like me. Just don't use my name. Right? So
wow.
it was really something. But over the years, almost every man would write a paper like that. Almost every guy does these days. Like they all, what's striking to me is they all still feel weird. They're like, I'm not like other guys. I really care about emotions, but I can't tell anyone. Right. Like, and I just have to like do these hookups. So it's like, so I think we're still not at that place where it's like, and I can tell my friends and my friends feel like me, where they're not saying I'm weird. So I think I still have all this pressure around their masculinity, and not all of them feel like they can say, and I won't choke someone if I don't want to. Right. So some of them do it and they like it. Some of them don't. They say it really makes me uncomfortable. Some of them won't. Like they may have tried it. They had a scary experience. They might have choked a partner unconscious without meaning to, and they're just that was terrifying. It was only a second, but like it was terrifying, right? And I don't want to feel that way when I'm having sex or making out with somebody. But then
right, we gender the conversations with kids about, like, so often we're telling girls or young women, like, you don't have to do something even if your partner asks you to, like, it's, whether or not those conversations are having an impact, Debbie, that's an ongoing question, but we forget to have those conversations with boys and young men. And I mean, Peggy's joke to me when I was texting with her after the piece came out based on your research, and she was like, every teenager in America hates me right now because their parents are all sitting them down and having a conversation with them about choking. And like, she wasn't wrong. Like, of course, Cara and I did, of course. And of course, like, people we know, but also not everybody was having a conversation with their kid about sex and choking. And I really, really hope, listening to Debbie, that listeners find a corner of what you're talking about and choose to have at least one conversation with your kid. And the part about the mental health and brain impact of choking,
it's unbelievable.
my kids were totally shocked by this research. So Debbie, can you talk about what we understand from brain research about the impact of choking?
Yeah, I can a little bit. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. And so my colleague, Kei Kawada, leads this research. He's incredible. We're so lucky to have him at the Indiana University School of Public Health because he normally studies athletes and studies like subconcussive injuries. But when I was doing this work and realizing, I was like, this has to affect the brain, right? It has to, because we know that strangulation in other contexts does. There's a wealth of research over the past decade on the impact of strangulation in intimate partner violence. And so we have colleagues who do that at other universities. And so, I thought, it just has to, right? It has to. Everyone's telling me, no, we do it differently. I was like, I don't know. So let's get somebody who does. So I went to him and I said, what do you think about this? And he saw the value in it, and his graduate students saw the value in it. And he's not wasn't a sexuality researcher, but we have brought him over to address these issues. So, the thing about the choking is, even if you are restricting, at any pressure that's enough to restrict the blood flow, the brain is not getting blood. And as I talk with my college students about, what does blood have, right? It has oxygen, it has glucose, which is food for the brain. So it's not getting blood, which has all these great nutrients in it. And also, depending on where you're choking on the neck, you may be having some trouble breathing, which is more of like if people are pressing the trachea or windpipe. We have about 40% of people who say that they've been choked in ways that have made it so they couldn't breathe or speak, which has lots of implications for consent or telling somebody that like it's not comfortable. And as my colleague Kay has pointed out too, that like there are these other issues that if you're sort of restricting the blood flow to the brain, that okay, it has moments of not having any, but then when you release the pressure, suddenly it's like flooding in a way that the brain is not used to. What he did is he took these two groups of women. We recruited women who had either been choked 4 or more times in the past month, or women who had reported having never been choked during sex. And they came into his lab, and he and his graduate students, did the fMRI, which is like a brain scan. They also took samples of blood from them so that they could look for blood biomarkers. So the brain, you're able to sort of detect like how the brain is responding to different stressors, if you will, or insults. And so they were able to see in a variety of ways that there were differences between the brains of these two groups of women. And the one that always sticks out to me is the one where they did on working memory tasks, where all of these women were college or graduate students, right? So they're already a group of people who are, they're smart, they've got education, they're young, they're generally pretty healthy people. So both of these groups of women, when they had them in the brain scanner and they gave them different memory tasks to perform, they actually were both able to arrive at the correct solutions. And that makes some sense, right? Again, like they're pretty like young, healthy, educated, all of that. But what they noticed, and the advantage of being able to do the brain scans, is that they noticed that they were able to track that it took the group who had been choked, it took them longer to arrive at the correct solutions. And they also had to recruit more parts of their brain to arrive at those correct solutions. So as he describes it, there's evidence that their brains are less efficient. And then there were some other aspects that, there's been, I think, like 4 papers that his team has published now from this. And there's some other sense that like the physical structure of the brain is different. And so there might be some sort of smoothing out of the brain, which I guess, as I understand it, again, not a neuroscientist, but happens to us all with age and time. But to be seeing this smoothing out, if you will, at these younger ages is concerning. And the research on strangulation overall, again, not even in the sexual space, would suggest that we can also have like damage to the hippocampus, which stores our memories. And some of that damage is probably damage that can be reversed, but some of it, if it's extensive, may not be. So some of the colleagues that I work with, like in the medical world, again, we have no evidence. We have not followed anyone 20 or 30 years out, but some of them are looking at this and saying, the first thing they'll say to me is, I'm really worried about their dementia risk down.
This is where I was going to go, which is, are there long-term studies that are in process now? Because it's not just dementia. I mean, that's like for sure the endpoint, but so many pieces to this. We call young brains plastic, meaning bendable plastic, because when one part is damaged, another part can sometimes pick up what that other part was supposed to do and do it for that part of the brain. So there's this incredible sort of flexibility in a young brain, not always. And the CTE data that we're seeing in young athletes is quite frankly terrifying, because we can see mood disorders, behavioral shifts, like mental health crises in young brains that are later found to have had CTE. So those are, the classic story is the football player who dies young, has an autopsy, and the brain is found to be riddled with CTE. And the pathophysiology of strangulation, choking, right, looks to be similar. The scientific phrasing would be it seems to have a common final pathway, like they're all converging in the same place. That's humongous news.
And I will say, we spoke in front of a huge group of parents a few weeks ago, not long after the piece came out, Debbie, with your research in it. And some parents came to me and said, we know our kid is engaging in rough sex, and we don't know how, like, we've tried 8 different ways of talking to him about it. We're concerned. And I said, talk about this brain research, talk about commonalities with CTE. Right. Like, that is actually an effective way in, possibly with an adolescent male, in ways that other things may not be. So if some of you are wondering, where do I begin? That actually is an interesting possibility. Debbie, before we let you go and continue to do the amazing work that you're doing out in the world, I'd love to end with some advice for our listeners about the ways you like to frame for students and for kids to think about sexuality and sexual relationships in a positive way, right? Like, what is your sort of baseline goals for kids as they grow and mature and engage in sexual behavior with other people? What do you hope for them?
I mean, I always share with my college students that I'm not here to shame them. I'm not here to judge them. I am here to support them with lots of information so that they can figure out what's right for them. I do try to encourage them to remember that they get to create their sexual lives with a partner, that they don't have to be influenced, right, by their peers, their friends. They don't have to like do what their partner wants them to do. They also don't have a right to pressure or force their partner to do something, again, regardless of any gender, right? Because as you mentioned, we sometimes just say to girls, you don't have to do what other people want. But I also just try to frame sexuality and intimacy as having a lot of potential for like wonderment. I mean, I think it's like, I love my field. I love being in this, but I think it's, I think even with the choking stuff, as stark as it is, and the rough sex stuff, sometimes it can be really challenging. I think sometimes what gets lost is it doesn't mean that everybody is doomed and having an awful experience. I hear amazing stories. I hear amazing stories of people who might make different choices from other people, but like they're okay in a lot of ways, right? And some of them do choose to take on risks that other people might not. But most of them, I will say, when I share, especially the health related research, they say, no one ever told me this. I
Mhm.
wish somebody had told me these
Mhm.
things. And now that I know this, if you are kind of, supporting them and giving them enough information, they might, like my students will say, I've learned enough about sex that I know there's so many other things I could be doing with my
Right.
partner that will feel good to us both and aren't going to put either one of us at risk. I also think, especially in terms of talking with young people, to really always come from a place of like care and compassion for other people, even if they're not the love of your life. Like you probably care enough about them. Hopefully, you care about them enough as a person that you're not going to want to harm them in any way, right?
Mhm.
So
Right.
you can create things, and you can do it from a place of care and compassion.
I
The
love that.
world is so lucky that you're the one studying this. You're just the right person on the right team to be doing this research. We can't wait to hear more about what you find. We are starving for data, but it's only in service to conversation and helping all the adults who love tweens and teens and 20 somethings learn and sort of build the courage and resilience to get into conversation with these kids. They're all still kids who clearly, from where we started this conversation, want to talk about it. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We're so happy to know you, and we're so grateful for what you do.
And Debbie, we'll link to Yes, Your Kid, your phenomenal book, in the show notes. And for people looking for more data, more information, more guidance, you can pick up a copy of Debbie's book. It's fantastic. It's super readable, layered with compassion. It has all the tone and vibe that will really help you navigate having these conversations in your own family, in your own community. And Debbie, come back and visit us.
Thank you. I'd love to.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.